Hey, what's up, guys? All right, this is going to be the final lecture. I'm sure many of you are applauding. So let's kind of go through some things after Nixon. So we know that Gerald Ford became president. He's the one that pardoned Nixon. And then there's the election in 1976. The Democrats, they put out Jimmy Carter from Georgia. He's a peanut farmer. And the Republicans put out Gerald Ford. Jimmy Carter ended up winning. And one of the things that he did was he guaranteed the peaceful transfer of power of the Panama Canal to the Panama people. That would happen in 1999. He officially recognized China in 1979 as a country, but again, kind of trying to limit some of the Cold War stuff. In 1979, SALT II was proposed, which would have again reduced nuclear armaments even more, but did not pass the Senate. In 1978, he helped engineer what became known as the Camp David Accords, which were a series of meetings between Israel and Egypt, the United States. Egypt recognized Israel. Israel gave up land in the Sinai to Egypt, and so there's an agreement between Egypt, which again is an African country, but is considered, a little bit more of an Arab sort of country. And then one of the things he had to deal with, Cold War-wise, another proxy war, is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. One of the things that ended up happening was we ended up boycotting the Moscow Olympic Games. So the United States, again, we did not fight in the war, but we provided aid to the Afghani people, training and everything else, which essentially, after we leave, sets up a situation for the Taliban to come to power. Another thing that he had to deal with was the 1978 Iranian Revolution, which forced the American-backed Shah of Iran to flee. He was replaced by a religious leader named the Ayatollah Khomeini. He said that the United States was the great Satan. So Carter allowed the Shah to come to the United States because he was fleeing. 400 Iranians ended up breaking into the American embassy in Tehran on November 4th, 1979, took Americans hostage. In 1980, there was a failed rescue attempt by some Marines, and then eventually the hostages were released on January 20th, 1980, which is the same day that President Reagan was inaugurated. So the election in 1980, the Democrats again had Jimmy Carter. The Republicans put out Ronald Reagan, who was a Hollywood star, former governor of California, and George Bush became his vice president. He wanted to increase defense spending. One of the ways to be able to do that was to reduce social programs, advocated for traditional American values. He advocated for what became known as Reaganomics. The idea was to give more tax breaks to the rich, and that would mean that they'd have more money to spend on everybody else, and then they began to call this trickle down. So 25% tax cuts for everybody, but again, it was a significant amount of tax cuts for the rich. Budget Reconciliation Act in 1981 cut $39 billion from domestic programs, but the defense budget increased by $12 billion. One of the things that they proposed was SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, which people began calling Star Wars. And it was a computer-controlled system that would destroy incoming enemy missiles from space. Congress did not approve. There was an assassination attempt on President Reagan. A guy by the name of John Hinckley shot Reagan in the chest on March 30th, 1981. President made a swift recovery. All of the conservative Republicans, very religious Republicans, believed it was a sign of God. Hinckley was actually trying to impress actress Jodie Foster by doing this, but it helped increase Reagan's popularity. He did nominate the first woman to the Supreme Court, and that's Sandra Day O'Connor. He did oppose equal pay for equal work for women and opposed the renewal of the Voting Rights Act. Reagan called the USSR the evil empire, placed new missiles in countries across Europe. And then something important happened. This guy right here, Mikhail Gorby, became the Soviet premier in 1985, and they began a relationship that would eventually begin the end of the Cold War. A really controversial thing that took place during this time was called the Iran-Contra affair. So essentially what happened was the United States, because we had issues with Iran, we actually were able to get their neighbors, Iraq, to go to war with them. And so a war took place between Iran and Iraq. We were supporting Iraq in this war, and we essentially helped a guy by the name of Saddam Hussein come to power, gave them weapons, gave them training. But then we realized that since this war was going on, we might as well sell weapons to Iran also. Yes, that's right. We were supplying weapons to Iraq, but at the same time selling weapons to the same country that we are not friendly with and that we got Iraq to fight. Now, what were we doing with all the money that was actually being made from selling weapons to Iran? Well, what had happened was in Nicaragua, there was a revolution there, and what ended up happening was the United States did not want this sort of quote-unquote communist revolution to take place, and so we used the money from the selling of weapons to Iran to actually fund this counter-revolutionary force in Nicaragua. This became known as the Iran-Contra Affair of 1986. On October 19th, 1987, it's actually my brother's birthday. He was 4 years old. We call it Black Monday. The Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped more than 20%, over $1 trillion loss. Small recession followed. Up until the 2008 recession, this was the biggest one since 1929. And then, of course, the NASA tragedy. I was actually homesick that day. I saw this happen. On January 28th, 1986, Space Shuttle Challenger exploded soon after liftoff. Everybody on board perished, raised questions about the program, whether or not we should keep spending. And then in the election of 1988, we get the Democrats electing Michael Dukakis. The Republicans nominated George Bush. George ends up winning. We get, under George Bush, the Americans with Disabilities Act, bar discrimination against people with physical or mental disabilities. This is really good. We also get the USSR and the collapse of communism coming down. So there was a conference that took place in Malta, agreed the Cold War was over, the USSR began to break up, and the collapse of the Berlin Wall. This is actually how Ukraine in 1991 came to become its own country. And then while I was in middle school, President Bush also had to entertain a Persian Gulf War. So what had happened was this country right here, which is an ally, Kuwait, which has a lot of oil also, they were invaded by Iraq. Again, Iraq, the same country that we had just recently, before this, right, essentially funded, given weapons to, train to go to war with Iran, their neighbor. They now decided to take all of that technology, all of that training, and invade Kuwait. And so this resulted in the first Persian Gulf War. So it starts in February 1991, and it ends in April 1991. 115 Americans died. The election in 1982, the Republicans again put out George Bush, the Democrats William Jefferson Clinton of Arkansas. Clinton won the election. Some of the things that unfortunately are tagged to President Clinton, right? The Monica Lewinsky affair. There was also issues in terms of like insurance and real estate called the Whitewater affair. Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and then the North American Free Trade Agreement. So what was that? The North American Free Trade Agreement, enacted in 1984, created a free trade zone for Mexico, Canada, and the United States. Most important feature is the U.S.-Mexico bilateral commercial relationship. So as of January 1st, all tariffs and quotas are eliminated on U.S. exports to Mexico and Canada. So the three countries don't do this to each other. President Clinton also had to deal with the Bosnian War, international armed conflict that took place in Bosnia and Herzegovina between 1982 and 1995. The war is commonly seen as having started on April 6, 1992. Following a number of earlier violent incidents, the war ended on 14th of December 1995. Okay, the election of 2000, President Bush and Al Gore ran against each other. President Bush ends up winning. There was controversy because of Florida and whether or not some of the votes should have been counted the way that they were, and did they need to do a recount. And it eventually went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court in 2001 said that George Bush had won Florida and therefore finished with 271 votes and won the election. One of the things, obviously, that the president had to deal with was the 9/11 terrorist attacks. So series of 4 attacks, right? So obviously New York, there was a plane that went down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and then of course the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. I was actually at school because I used to get here super early. This was my beginning of my second year as a teacher. I was at school and I actually saw the second plane, as you see. I actually saw that, as you see right there, happen live. It was obviously really unfortunate. As a result, because Osama bin Laden was hiding in Afghanistan, and Afghanistan wouldn't turn him over, the United States engaged in a war with Afghanistan that will take us from 2001 to 2021. It is the longest war the United States has been involved in. And then also because Saddam Hussein was supplying weapons, and because there was also fear that he had some sort of weapons that he was going to use to attack the United States. We went to war with Iraq between 2003 2011. Saddam Hussein was overthrown as the leader of Iraq, and he was actually killed. A very controversial thing that happens because of this is the Patriot Act, which was very similar to the Alien and Sedition Acts, which was very similar to the Espionage Act, which was very similar to the Smith Act. The federal government enacted the Patriot Act. What does it do? It expands surveillance, easier interagency communication, and increased penalties for terrorist activities. And then the last thing here, right, is the election of 2008. So the election of Barack Obama as the country's first African-American president. And I'm going to stop there.